to continue a series we've been on for a few weeks now called Under Pressure. And what we're doing is looking at different aspects of our life, different parts of our life that pressure seems to attach itself to. In other words, there's different areas of our life that when we look around, the next thing we find out is there's pressure and tension and strife around that area. We began talking in the first message about relational pressure. I wonder if anybody's had a problem in a relationship. That's all of us, right? And we talk about that pressure that centers around that relationship and what God says to do about it. That's the first message. In the second message, we talked about something we all know something about, and that is financial pressure. I assume that all of us in this room at one time or another have been in a financial strain, financial pressure and stress and tension. So we talked about that in the second message and what God says about that. Now, last week, many of you weren't here. You were on spring break. We talked about a vocational pressure. Do you have any pressure or any stress when it comes to your vocation, when it comes to your job, when it comes to your workplace? I'm sure we've all been there as well. What does the Bible say about that? So that's the previous three messages. Today I want to talk to you about this subject, emotional pressure. Emotional pressure. And what I'm talking about today is something that we all experience, and I think that emotional pressure begins in here, okay? Or at least it settles right here. It's the pressure that we have on the inside of us. The pressure maybe your spouse doesn't know about. You hide it from your family. You hide it from your coworkers and your friends. And you try to come out with this bubbly personality that everything's fine. But inside there's turmoil. There's pressure. There's tension. And there's strife. So today I want to talk to you about emotional pressure and what does God say about that pressure in our life. Now, you would think that emotional pressure starts here. It doesn't always start here. Typically, emotional pressure starts out there and then gradually ends up here. For example, look at our world today. What do we have? We have global pressure everywhere. Have you watched the news lately? Or podcast the news? Or listen to the news on your phone? What do we have today? We have world tension, don't we? For example, when you think of world tension today, where does your mind and heart go? To Ukraine, to Russia, to North Korea, to China. And you wonder what all these countries are going to do. And before long, as you watch the news or listen to the news, that global pressure out there, that world tension out there settles where? It begins to settle in our heart. Another topic today is individual rights. Everybody's screaming for their own individual rights. In other words, I can have an abortion if I want to have an abortion. Or I can express myself sexually any way I want to express myself. So when you hear about that and you hear what's going on in our culture, what does it do? If you're a mom and dad, you wonder what's going to happen to morality for your children and for our grandchildren 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15, 20 years from now. What's the landscape of morality going to look like in this country? And because we see all this and hear all this, where does it settle? It settles here. How about social discrimination? Social injustice. A big topic today is immigration. What are we going to do about our borders and people coming over our borders illegally? How about discrimination and all the minorities in our country? And we look at all this social injustice. Again, we see it on the TV. We hear it on our phones. And where does it begin to settle? Right here. What's going to happen to the United States of America? Is the United going to divide along social lines? Then we think about today political corruption. It's everywhere, right? You know, you think about Washington and you think about who we're sending up there, and we think about what are they doing for us, the people that they represent. So many times I can't figure out, you go to be in Congress, for example, and the job pays maybe $200,000 or $300,000 a year, and at the end of a 4-year stint, you come out a multi-millionaire. I know I'm not that good at math, but I can figure that one out, right? What's going on? So you think about what's happening politically in our country. Is anybody listening to us as a people? So my point is this: the emotional pressure that's here typically starts out there. And if we watch enough of it, hear enough of it, pretty soon it lands in our heart. But also, not only this global world pressure, but this personal pressure that builds in our life. Now, how is it shown in our life? Well, first of all, through anxiety. Our culture right now has more anxiety maybe than it ever has. We think about COVID. We just got out of COVID. Hopefully, we're out of COVID, right? And we think about the pressure, the anxiety. So many people have so much anxiety in their life now. They're on so many pills that they can't function right. Can they? We think of burnout is the highest it's ever been in every area. Okay? A man burns out. So he leaves his family. Or the wife leaves the family. They're burnt out. They're tired. They leave their job. They quit it all. They're completely and totally burnt out. And then there's depression. Not just, hey, I'm not up today, but depression that is such as, I can't function. I have to take 2 or 3 days off work. I have to take a week off work. I can't go. I can't get out of bed. So we take a pill to get up in the morning. We take a pill to go to bed at night. It's depression. Then it comes in the form of being overwhelmed. When I think about today and I look at our society, so many people are overwhelmed with all these things. Can we just be honest today? Many of us in this room, many of us watching online, you're under emotional pressure today to the point you're about ready to crack. And you don't know if you're going to make it. Let's just be honest. Many of us are there today. Some of us are not quite there, but we're getting there. So today I want to talk to you about a very familiar name to most of you. It's a prophet named Elijah. How many have heard of that name before? Let me see your hand. Elijah. We're going to look at a man at a time in his life when he was under a great stress, great emotional pressure. Now let me give you a background, the backstory of what we're going to talk about today. Elijah is called by God to prophesy to the northern kingdom. Israel split, we'll get into this over the overview of the Bible, to the northern and the southern kingdoms after Solomon died and Rehoboam, his son, came to the throne. The nation of Israel split to the northern and the southern kingdoms. Both kingdoms will eventually be destroyed because of their sin. But prior to that, God called this prophet Elijah to the northern kingdom, to a king that you might be familiar with named Ahab. And he had a wife that you might be familiar with called Jezebel. Okay? And so God calls Elijah to go to King Ahab and to Jezebel and began to testify and prophesy against them because they were leading the people into Baal, B-A-A-L, Baal worship, a false god. In fact, Jezebel centered around her and centered her out through this northern kingdom 450 prophets of Baal. And so God calls Elijah, and he comes in on the scene. And he gathers all the people together, and he says something that you might have heard before, a verse you might have heard. He says, if the Lord be God, then follow him. If Baal be God, follow him. So what they did is they got two bulls together, okay? Put them on an altar. And here was the test. The 450 prophets of Baal would call out to Baal, and if Baal could send fire from heaven and burn up the sacrifices, then Baal would be God. But on the other hand, if the prophet Elijah called on Jehovah God, and he answered by fire, and fire came from heaven and burned up the sacrifice, then he would be God. Many of you know the story. It took place where? At a place called Mount Carmel. And so the prophets of Baal are first. They cry from morning to midday to late afternoon. The Bible says they holler and scream, they cut themselves, they do everything to try to get Baal to answer by fire and to burn up these sacrifices to no avail. Elijah gets up and he taunts them. He says, well, maybe Baal's asleep, okay? Maybe this is his day off, and a lot of other things he tells them. And then the mighty prophet calls out to God, and fire came down, licked up those sacrifices. And then Elijah said this. He said, you catch these prophets of Baal, these 450 men, and I want you to put them to death. A great victory for Jehovah God. A great victory for Israel. But something happens the next day. Elijah gets word from Jezebel that she's going to kill him. Now, you would have thought the prophet Elijah would have said, big deal, right? I mean, I just seen God. Fire from heaven. Sacrifices burn up. Prophets of Baal destroyed. You would have thought he would have said, send her a telegram back. I'm not scared. I'm not moving. But is that what happened? No. He became scared. He became afraid. He became emotionally stressed and strained to the point he ran off. He was under all this emotional pressure. Here's my thought today. What God told the prophet Elijah, under all this pressure, tension, strife, and strain, is the same thing God tells us today. Again, because I believe I am talking to some people today that you're under emotional pressure. So what God told Elijah is what he tells us today. 3 words I want to give you. You ready? What do we do, Brother Ron, if we're under this emotional pressure? First of all, we have to refresh. We have to refresh. Now, you're in 1 Kings. Did you find it? 1 Kings chapter 19. Let's look at starting at verse 4. It'll come up on your screen. Let's read a little bit. But he himself, after he got the threat from Jezebel, but he, talking about the prophet Elijah, himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree or a juniper tree shaped like a broom. That's why they call it that. And he prayed that he might die and said, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life if I'm no better than my father's. Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. Verse 8. So he arose and ate, drank, and he went in the strength of that 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. The first thing we do, if we're under this emotional pressure and strain and stress, the first thing that God tells Elijah to do is that you need to refresh yourself, Elijah. That's what you need to do. In other words, Elijah, you need to take a step back and you need to look at what's going on. When you're under this emotional pressure, as you're in the midst of it, the best thing you can do is you begin to deal with it, as you begin to say, Lord, I need to be refreshed, is that you need to take a step backwards. You need to take a step backwards and look at what's going on around you. Take your head out of whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through. Take your head out of there and come back so you can get a better look exactly what's going on in your life. That way you begin to start this process of refreshing yourself in the Lord. But if you just keep in it and you won't let go of it and you won't take the step back like you should, nothing's going to change. But if you will just stop, look at it from a different point of view, a different angle, I believe things will change and it will lead you to be refreshed. I can remember years ago when I was in Fort Worth and I was in seminary. In seminary, you have to take 2 languages, basically. You have to take Hebrew. Why would you have to take Hebrew? Because the Old Testament was written in what? Hebrew. And then you have to take Greek. Why do you have to take Greek? Because the New Testament was written in Greek. Well, I had a buddy named Kevin Cherwinski. Does that name give him away? He was a Yankee from Rhode Island. I don't know how I ever got in touch with him or got together with him, but he became a good friend of mine. We came up with this crazy idea that one summer we're going to take what they called Turbo Greek. That was the name of it. In other words, you're going to take 2 semesters of Greek in 6 weeks. And so we went in and started going to class and went into class. Now, what I had to do, the class was at 8 o'clock in the morning. It got over at 10 o'clock, and then I had to go to work. So I went to work to 6 or 7 at night. So I came home, and Kevin and I would meet to study for the next day because everything was going very quickly, thus Turbo Greek, okay? So we would meet at Wild Bill's Cafe. You know where that is? That's on the campus of Southwestern Seminary. Or we'd go find a restaurant. Sometimes he'd come over to my house, okay? And we would study Turbo Greek. And can I just say, I was a younger man back then, but I got tired. Have you ever been mentally tired? Let me see your hand. When you're mentally tired, it's not long before you're what? Physically tired. And so we'd be sitting there trying to study this, and Greek is nothing but paradigms. You got to learn paradigms. Now, I love Greek, but I hated Hebrew. Hebrew is a language that reads from right to left. You know it's messed up, right? I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't wait to get out of Hebrew. But I love Greek, so I thought, Turbo Greek won't be no problem. I became so tired after about the first and second week. I didn't think I was going to make it. And Kevin Cherwinski said, Ron, here's what you do. You need to take a power nap. Does anybody know what a power nap is? I didn't know what it was. I laughed at in his face. What are you talking about, a power? I need a nap, okay, but I need a sure enough nap. He said, a power nap. He said, stop, close your eyes, relax for 10 minutes. And I thought to myself, that's really going to do a lot of good. But I began to do that. When I was stressed out, under all this emotional strain and pressure, I just stopped. Take a power nap. Do you know I got through Turbo Greek because of power naps? I got refreshed because I stepped back from all this work and I took a power nap. Can I say this to some of you today who are under this emotional pressure? You need to step back from all that you're in, no matter what it is, and you need to take a power nap. Okay? This is exactly what God told Elijah. Now, when you read this, it's amazing to me. You know what I figured God would say? What do you figure God would say to Elijah? Get yourself up. Come on, boy, let's go. Get up and get back at it, right? That's not what God told him to do. Step back. I'm going to refresh you, and then you can go on and do what I've called you to do. Now, I made a little chart here. We're going to put it up now. I want you to look at it. The verses I just read, this is what God told Elijah to do. How to refresh himself. First of all, he was to get away. Verse 4 talks about a day's journey. Sometimes you need to get away from all the stress and strain. Now, it could be, listen, that could be for an hour, 2 hours, a half a day. That could be a day. That could be a week. That means you might get a book, go to the coffee shop. Ladies, go to the mall. Amen. He said, what? First of all, we have to get away. A lot of times during the day, I'll be working and so forth and so on. And you know where I get away to? I go around to the front where all the windows are over here, all the couches. Now, I don't lay down, okay? I know some of you probably got cameras focused towards the church, you know. Can we catch Brother Ron? No. I sit in a chair, and I'll just read a book. I get away from it. Maybe you need to do that. Stick your head out of the stress and the strain, the pressure, and get away. Second of all, to sleep more. That's what it says in verse 5. To sleep more. This is God saying, okay, you need to get away. Now you need to sleep more. Can I just say this? Will you not get mad at me? Some of you need to go to bed earlier, okay? Hadn't your mama taught you that nothing good happens after midnight? How many of y'all go to bed, say, 9 o'clock? Let me see your hand. That's every senior adult in here. How many of y'all go between 10 and 11? Let me see your hand. How many go past midnight? Gosh. Sometimes you just need to sleep a little longer. Go to bed a little earlier. You'd be surprised what the mornings will be. You really will. Something else. Verse 6, he said, to eat better, a cake baked. Now, I don't want to hone on this too much, but listen. Maybe sometimes we need to take the junk food that makes us what? Blah. Right? Okay. Now, I've been going to the gym. We're working out of the gym. I love it. I've been working out of the gym. And I'll have you know, you can ask Debbie after the service. We have Girl Scout cookies in our cabinet, and I have not ate one. Don't clap too quick now. I might go ahead and get in there, okay? What am I saying? Sometimes you got to try to eat better. I know, listen, I say this all the time. Most of us have been trying to lose 20 pounds for 20 years, right? If we could just get 10, 15, 20 pounds, right? But you eat better. And then sometimes you need extended time away. He comes in verse 7, he says, a second time. So he makes him sleep and eat all over again. Sometimes you need a vacation. Sometimes you need to get away an extended time. Sometimes you need a sabbatical. Sometimes you need to get it away. Here's what I'm saying this morning. I'm simply saying that if you're under emotional pressure, you need to refresh. That's exactly what God told Elijah. Second thing I want you to see this morning. If you're under emotional pressure, stress and strain, first of all, you refresh. But second of all, you have to refocus. You have to refocus. Now, go back to 1 Kings 19. Look, if you will, starting in verse 9. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So he said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, tore down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." What happened to Elijah? He needed to be refreshed, okay? But he also needed to refocus. Why? He lost his focus. And let me say this too. When you and I, as children of God, lose our focus on God, there's only one place that focus can go. Where is that? It's to the world. In other words, we go through life, we're under this emotional pressure, strain, and stress. What happens to us many times? We get our eyes off God, don't we? And we get our eyes off God, there's only one place we can put our eyes, and that's on the world. And we get our eyes on the world, there's nothing but pressure, strife, and stress out in the world. So you're going to have to learn to refocus. Not only refresh, but refocus if this emotional pressure is going to begin to dwindle in your life. Now, I want to be honest with you this morning. Brother Ron can get my focus seemingly very easily off God. And there's basically something that always gets my focus off God. And it's probably not what you think it is. I get my focus off God when I can't figure out something. I don't know if that sounds logical to you or not, but that's how I'm wired. Let me give you a couple illustrations. Just recently, I've been going through the overview of the Bible. I've been working very hard trying to do this, okay? Most preachers, we want to preach, okay, say a lot of things. It's a whole different world to me to take a whole book of the Bible and go down, okay? Genesis has got 50 chapters in it. Do you know how long it would take Brother Ron to preach 50 chapters? So now I'm having to force myself, instead of saying I got plenty of time, I can go through this at my leisure, now I got to go back down. But as I was going through the overview of the Bible, I had made my way to Daniel. How many chapters does Daniel have? Anybody know? Has 12 chapters. The first 6 chapters, everybody preaches on. Right? You rarely hear anything from chapter 7 to chapter 12. You know why? Basically, in those chapters, Daniel has 4 visions. And some of those visions haven't even happened yet. They're still in the future. So I got to those chapters. And can I just be honest with you? I shut down. God, what in the world? What is he talking about? It took me 3 days, which is very rare, to try to come to grips with what those chapters were about. But I shut down. I'd go home at night to Debbie. I'm tired. I'm wore out. I'm mentally exhausted. I'm physically exhausted. I was beginning to shut down because I can usually do a message in a few hours, a day at the very tops. I'm 3 and 4 days trying to figure these visions out. And I had to watch myself because I was shutting down. I didn't understand it. And then something, I'll just be honest with you, I've been dealing with for a long time. Big theological question. I know most of you probably don't even think about things Brother Ron thinks about. Think about God. I think about sin. I think about the devil. I think about how they all interact. And I've been dealing with theological questions for years now, and sometimes it just wears me out. I can't figure it out. Until I go back to this one verse, the secret things belong to God. The things revealed belong to the sons of men. How many of you know there's some things you're not going to figure out? But I will die trying to figure it out. So sometimes you have to refocus. Now, you have to refocus on your commitment. What's your commitment? You gave your life to Jesus, right? Sometimes it's just as simple as to go back to that commitment that you made when you were 10 years old or 12 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old, whatever it was. You have to go back to that. That's your foundation. The day you met the Lord, when I lead someone to Christ, for example, in my office, I tell them to write the date down, put it in their Bible, the date and the time they receive the Lord, because that's your foundation. Sometimes you have to go back to that in your life. You know, I've told you I listen and watch a lot of sermons during the week. I typically watch about 7 churches. Okay, you come to church once a week, you think you've had enough. I get 7 more typically, sometimes more, that I'll watch. Okay? And you have to be a pastor to understand this, but I see some of these churches, they're talking about revivals hit here. Revival, and everybody's talking about revival. I was online the other day, and a church was saying they had 600 and some people healed in a service. Then I watch another church, and something's going on there. And I'm thinking, what in the world? And you're thinking as a pastor, you know, I don't know that that's happening here. Okay? And every time I go to God and I say, God, what about this is happening in that church and that? There's always something happening in churches. You know what God always leads me back to? He always leads me back to my commitment. What's that, Brother Ron? The commitment I made to this church and to the ministry I have here 20 years ago. He brings me back. I called you to a place called Fannin that you didn't even know existed. I called you to a hill in Fannin and a church in Fannin, and I called you to teach my word and to love my people. And son, don't ever forget that. And I have to go back to that. Now listen, not that I don't want to see revival or see people healed. But folks, what's happening, I think, many times, when you see revival here, there, and yonder, you act like you got to go there. Listen, why can't revival happen where you're at? Amen. In the pews right now. The same God that's over there is the same God here. Amen. Or if God heals over here, how come God can't heal here? He can. Follow everybody everywhere. You know, that's what some Christians do. They just follow whatever's happening in Christianity. Here they follow. I'm saying we got the same God, can do the same thing if we as God's people will call upon Him. But you go back to your commitment. The commitment is, I teach you the Word of God. Been doing that for a long time, and I love you. And out of that, God will bring what He wants to bring. If we'll seek the God, we'll be found of Him. You have to refocus. If you're in emotional pressure today, refocus on your commitment to God. Refocus on your commitment to church. Refocus on your commitment to the Word of God and prayer and to the things of God. It's the simple things that make the difference. If you're dry today spiritually, refocus on the simple disciplines of the Christian faith that will revive you. Refocus. Refocus on your commitment, but also refocus on your circumstances. On your circumstances, quickly. Most of you know, as I said, that I was with Debbie a few weeks ago. We were in the hospital. We were in the ER room, and things were happening so fast. Debbie was losing so much blood. Her blood pressure went from 70 to over 30. And they were shooting her with blood, 2 pints of blood, and all these things were going on. But when we first got there by the ambulance, they wouldn't let me go back there. Okay? So I was sitting in the ER waiting room, people everywhere. So I'm sitting there, and I noticed a lady to my right, she was crying. And I heard her say something about her mom, so forth and so on. And the Spirit of God says, Ron, go talk to her. So I waited a few minutes, got up and went and talked to her, put my arm around her and said, tell me what's happening. And her mom and her had been there since about 6 or 7 hours and still had not been seen, so forth and so on. Her mother needed this treatment. And I began to say, can I pray with you? She says, yes, you can. So I prayed with her and talked to her for a little bit. Then went back to my seat in the ER. Just a few minutes later, the Lord said there's somebody else around beside her. And there was this black lady around beside her. So I went over and said, hey, what's going on? Why are you here? She began to tell me about her mom who was sick. Her grandmother had just died. Her 2 children were there with her in the ER. And we began to talk. And I said, can I pray with you? She said, sure. I prayed with her. I went back and sat in my seat. I'm waiting for them to call me back to see my wife, okay? Last time I saw her, she was bleeding heavy. I sat back down, I looked across the way, and there was a couple. I found out they weren't a couple, they were a brother and sister. He had lost a leg. He was in a wheelchair. And I said, the Lord said, go talk to them. So I went over and began to put my arm around them and talk to them. And I said, can I pray for you? Now, here's my point. My point is simply this. I could have looked at them circumstances and said, my wife's back there in the ER, and she's bleeding, and things are going on. And I could sit out in the waiting room, but God says, listen, son, I got these circumstances. Now, you go see these other people. Because many of them are a lot worse shape than your wife are, or is. And then after that, they called me back with Debbie. Folks, sometimes you got to do what? We focus on your circumstances. Okay? You got to do that. Typically, they're not near as bad as we think they are. So this morning, are you under emotional pressure? If you are, what did God tell Elijah? You have to refresh. You have to refocus. And lastly, you have to refine. Refined. Look, if you will, now, verse 11. We'll end it up. 1 Kings 19:11. Then he said, God said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rock into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. How many of y'all are prone to lose things? Let me see your hand. Come on, let's be honest. Okay, you know what Brother Ron loses all the time? Books, batteries, and erasers. Books, because I got an office at home and I got an office here. Batteries. Can never find the right battery. Never can find where it's at. And then erasers. I use a pencil. And the erasers, okay? Melissa, now Christy will find this out. She's a new secretary, but Melissa has been here for 9 years. She keeps me stocked full of those erasers. And I use a special red pen to underline in my Bible, and I use a special highlighter. Now, here's what I do. I say, I'm going to put this in a certain place that I'll never forget where it's at. Anybody ever done that? Does anybody have a junk drawer in their kitchen? So if I went through your kitchen, you'd have a junk drawer, right? But anyway, I thought, well, I'll put it in the junk drawer. I'll put it a certain place on my desk, or I'll put it, and I said, I'll never, ever forget it. What happens? I forget it. I go back to Melissa, and I said, Melissa, I need some more erasers. I need some more highlighters or red pens. She said, you can't possibly need any. I ordered them. I said, listen, I need them. A few days later, I got to go back to Melissa, which will now be Christy, and tell her what? I found them. As we close this morning, what did Elijah need to refine? The still, small voice of God. Once you hear that still, small voice that maybe you haven't heard in a long time, the emotional pressure will dissipate. Begin to dissipate in your life. We've got to find it. With your heads bowed and your eyes closed as Gray and the praise team come. Would you just be honest with God? I want everyone, whether you're in the building or watching online, will you take just a moment to talk to God? Will you take just a moment to tell Him where you're at spiritually, where you're at emotionally? Just talk to Him and say, Lord, I'm on so much emotional pressure, stress and strain. God, I'm about ready to crack. I don't know if I can go on. Would you talk to Him this morning? Would you let God do what He did to Elijah to you? Because you can't continue that way. So whatever God is speaking to your heart about, whatever weight or load that you're carrying today, Jesus said, come unto me, all you are heavy laden and weary, and I will give you rest. Come and hear and listen for that still small voice. And whatever He says to you, would you do it? Some of you might need to give your heart to Jesus today. I'm going to invite you to get out of your seat in just a moment, walk down. Let us show you what a relationship with Jesus means. Some of you need just prayer. We want to pray with you today. We want to hear your story. Some of you need to come and join this fellowship. What is your need today? As all my counselors come to the front, all my counselors come to the front. Listen, these people love you. We're here to pray with you. Whatever we can do for you, we want to be able to do. They'll be spread out across the front of the auditorium. I'll be down front. Find someone. Pray about what you're going through. See what God.
Thank you for tuning in to our live stream. We hope you were encouraged by both the worship music and today's message. If you have any questions about your faith or would like to speak to our pastoral staff, we would love to hear from you. You may call the church office at 601-829-1004 or contact us on our website at fbcfandon.org.